You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
Thank you so much for joining us. We would like to shout out our sponsors, Othram Labs and Boston Green Health, where you can get all your rest and relaxation needs taken care of.
I like the sound of that. We'd also like to remind you that we are working with Othram to help promote the Brianna Maitland case. And at their website, DNAsolves.com, they are crowdfunding to raise $5,000 to conduct DNA tests in the Brianna Maitland missing persons case. And we very much appreciate your support. You can contribute your DNA, where it will be used exclusively by law enforcement and Othram to solve cases, as well as making a financial contribution, whatever you can afford. We've contributed, and we hope you will too, at DNAsolves.com. We're also really excited. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to be bringing you the Brianna Maitland case, which is a very interesting missing persons case set in Vermont. And we'll be exploring that case over the next few weeks and hopefully bring some new insight to the Brianna Maitland case.
Certainly looking forward to it. We are happy to bring you today installment number 2 of our True Crime Bookshelf, which of course is one of my very favorite things to do, is to read about true crime. So we have a lot of great recommendations for you today. One recommendation that we would like to make at the top is to remind you that our friend Gemma Hoskins has her book coming out the first week of November. It's called Keeping On, and we do urge you to buy it because we have both read it, and it is excellent.
We also just noticed something. We were watching our downloads, which grow each week, and we were very excited. We were about to cross 150,000 downloads, and we forgot to mention it. And then Kristin checked today, and she said, never mind, we're at 160,000 downloads. We'd like to thank all of you for your support of Mind Over Murder. It's very exciting to be downloaded 160,000 times. And we very much appreciate your listening and telling your friends and supporting what we're doing here at Mind Over Murder. So a sincere thanks.
Thank you so much for listening to Mind Over Murder. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you next time. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And today we have our second edition of True Crime Bookshelf.
It was so popular.
It was so popular. Go ahead.
Just how popular was it?
It was so popular that we decided to do a second episode of it.
So here we are, True Crime Bookshelf, Volume 2.
Yes. Bill and I read a lot of true crime. I read more of it than Bill does, but we still have a pretty formidable collection between the two of us.
Just remember, anytime you mention a true crime title, when you mention it to Kristin Dilley, she says, oh yeah, I read that. So it's hard to keep up, but we try.
And because I also have this whole pesky other job in addition to this where I teach, I thought it would be kind of fun for this edition of True Crime Bookshelf to mix up my two professions, teaching and podcasting. And so my true crime selections for this edition of True Crime Bookshelf, I'll have a literary bent of one variety or another.
Which doesn't mean that people don't get killed and crimes are not committed. They do have all of that, do they not?
Yes, they do. All of these 3 books involve various very interesting true crime cases, but they all happen to involve a famous literary figure as well.
And I'm still rooting for the good guys, no matter what.
As you should. We should always root for the good guys.
All right. So be it.
So my first book selection is called The Beautiful Cigar Girl, Mary Rogers, Edgar Allan Poe, and the Invention of Murder by my friend Daniel Stashower. So shout out to Dan. He's an excellent writer. He knows Edgar Allan Poe probably better than most anyone that I've ever met.
I thought for a second you were going to say he knows Edgar Allan Poe personally.
Unfortunately, we can't give him that much awesomeness. But he is quite the expert on Edgar Allan Poe and on Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the inventor of Sherlock Holmes.
When did The Beautiful Cigar Girl come out?
So The Beautiful Cigar Girl came out in 2006, and it was nominated for an Edgar Award.
Very nice.
It is quite an excellent book. I have not only read it a couple of times, but it is actually the last thing that I gave a lecture on before school closed for this crazy world-altering pandemic.
Edgar Allan Poe would like this world-altering pandemic. I just know it.
He probably would, actually.
It seems like something that he would have lived through and written about.
Well, he did write about the Black Death, or its equivalent. He had a story called Mask of the Red Death,
yes,
which I read with my 11th graders every year. So yeah, Poe would definitely have found this to be particularly interesting, I think.
Let the record show I'm wincing.
He truly is. This is funny. So The Beautiful Cigar Girl is really two narratives in one. And the first half of the narrative is about the July 1841 murder of 21-year-old shop girl Mary Cecilia Rogers. Now, Mary Cecilia Rogers was called the Beautiful Cigar Girl for two reasons. One, she was beautiful, and two, she worked in a cigar shop in New York City. And it was because she was so beautiful, and she would lure doesn't sound quite right, but she would entice customers into the store, and she would sell them their tobacco and maybe do a little mild flirtation or what have you. But she was a great favorite of people in New York who visited this particular cigar emporium where she worked. Now, Mary Rogers was found floating in the Hudson River in July of 1841. And she was at first presumed to be a victim of gang violence. And her murder rocked the entire city. No one could believe that the beautiful cigar girl, Mary Cecilia Rogers, had been brutally murdered. It was awful. And the New York Police Department had a pretty difficult time trying to investigate the case and trying to solve the case. And so in the midst of all of the turmoil and publicity of the Mary Rogers case came Edgar Allan Poe. Now, anybody who is familiar with Poe, either from their own reading or from listening to their American literature teacher talk about it, will know that Edgar Allan Poe did not have a happy life, and he did not have a financially successful life either. And so Poe, in desperate need of money, at that point his wife was suffering from tuberculosis, and he needed some liquid finances so that he could help with her medical expenses, decided that he would take advantage, just sounds like such an awful thing, but he decided to take advantage of the hoopla of Mary Rogers' murder. And he wrote to a friend of his at a ladies' publication and said, I have a great idea. You guys have this unsolved murder case in New York. I happen to have a detective that I invented who I like very much, and I would like my detective to solve your murder mystery. And I'll write about it and tell you exactly how I, via my detective, Auguste Dupin, would solve the Mary Rogers case.
And this was a fictional detective.
A fictional detective. He said, my fictional detective will use his fictional methods, which Poe felt would be readily applicable to the real world. And he said his fictional detective would solve the actual murder of Mary Rogers.
That's a fascinating approach.
It really is, honestly. Poe gave it his all. He really did. His detective character, Auguste Dupin, who was French, had a way of solving crimes that Poe called ratiocination. And it's just a form of deductive reasoning where you look at clues that are left at the crime scene, but you don't go to the crime scene. Ratiocination is very similar to what the great detective Sherlock Holmes would do to solve his crimes in the series of stories and novels down the road starring Sherlock Holmes. And it did not involve having to go to a crime scene. It just involved being told what was at the crime scene. Pretty much the concept of an armchair detective was invented with Edgar Allan Poe. And his detective, Auguste Dupin, was really the first armchair detective. Poe took a look at the various clues in the crime scene and felt that he could have his fictional detective solve the Mary Rogers murder. And he would do it in 4 installments. Poe would write up each section and publish it and give the reading public time to read over it and get psyched for the next section. And then he would eventually, he believed, solve the crime. Now, whether or not Poe actually solved the crime, you'll find out when you read the book. I'm not going to give it that. I'm not going to give it away any further than that.
There's a tease here.
I don't want to spoil the book for you, but it is quite excellent because you learn a lot about Edgar Allan Poe, who is a fascinating guy in and of his own right. You learn a lot about the state of the New York Police Department in the 1840s. And I will give you a spoiler alert on this one. It was not good. The NYPD was not a crack group of police investigators at that point. They were very, very disorganized. And the reason that there has never been a commonly agreed upon solution to the Mary Rogers case is largely because there were a lot of problems in the initial investigation of the case.
Boy, where have we heard that one a few times before?
Yeah. So The Beautiful Cigar Girl it's really part biography of Poe. It's part true crime story because you do learn a lot about the Mary Rogers case. And there are some pretty unsavory elements of the whole entire thing. So be prepared for some, graphic descriptions of a body that's been in the river for a while. And you learn a lot about the very interesting process that Poe and his detective went through in trying to solve this crime. It's fascinating. I loved it. And like I said, it was the last thing that I lectured on before schools closed for this big pandemic. And my group of 11th and 12th grade students that I told about this book really liked it and seemed fascinated by it. That's why I figured, I bet our listeners would like it too.
I recall that Edgar Allan Poe moved around a bit. Was he living in New York at the time that he wrote the book?
No, he was not in New York at the time. Poe did move around quite a bit. He actually lived in Richmond for a while, which is one of the reasons why I've been fascinated with Poe. Mm-hmm. There's a Poe museum here in Richmond. It's very interesting to see where he lived and worked. But no, he was not in New York at the time when he wrote this.
I find it fascinating that even though many of us are Sherlock Holmes fans and we're very familiar with that fictional detective, this book predates the Holmes series with the fictional detective.
Yeah. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle has actually been quoted as saying that without Poe's detective, Auguste Dupin, who really only starred in 3 stories, he has said without Dupin, there would be no Sherlock Holmes.
That's fascinating.
So anybody who's a fan of Holmes, you really kind of have to look to his literary forerunner, Auguste Dupin, because he is quite as interesting and fascinating and enigmatic as Sherlock Holmes is.
And the 3 stories that you're referring to, are you talking about full-length books or short stories?
No, it's short stories. So it's the Murders in the Rue Morgue, mm-hmm. the Purloined Letter, and the story that the Mary Rogers case is based off of is called The Mystery of Marie Roget. He decided that because Dupin was French, he would go ahead and change Mary Rogers into a French girl. And so he called her Marie Roget instead of Mary Rogers.
I recall the first 2 stories being turned into movies as well, but I don't remember this one ever. Do you know if they ever made a movie of this story?
I don't think so, and I think that's largely because the story is kind of a mess. And again, I don't want to give away too much by explaining what precisely is weird and kind of goes wrong with the story, but it's certainly nothing that I'm aware of that has been made into a movie. I would love to see Dan's book made into a movie. So if anybody's interested, talk to Dan Stashower. It would make an excellent, excellent movie.
Oh, very cool.
Yes.
Spell Dan's last name?
Stashower. 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 He's an excellent writer, wonderful guy, very good friend. Hats off to Dan. He's amazing.
Very cool. Well, my first book is a little different. It's a bit more contemporary, shall we say. You recall that we had talked about Billy Jensen and Paul Holes on our show before, and Billy Jensen's book, Chase Darkness with Me, had come out last year. It's a New York Times bestseller. It's Chase Darkness with Me by Billy Jensen, How One True Crime Writer Started Solving Murders. And actually, the new paperback edition is coming out as we speak, and there's a lot of promotion around the latest edition of the book. This is the hardcover version from last year, which is excellent. For the new softcover edition, there's new content. They've added another chapter, and there's all kinds of promotions right now through various online bookstores. So it's a great read. Many of you may recall that Billy Jensen, who works with Paul Holes as part of a fantastic podcasting and television appearing duo, Jensen and Holes, the Murder Squad, they call themselves. Before they were podcasters, Billy Jensen was a journalist for a number of years. He was a true crime writer on Long Island in New York. He moved to Los Angeles. He covered cases all over the country for about 17 years. And then about 2 years ago this past spring, Michelle McNamara, who was a dear friend of his, passed away. And he was ultimately tasked by her husband, Patton Oswalt, the comedian, asked Billy and her researcher, a guy named Paul Haynes, another very talented writer, to finish her book. So they finished Michelle's book, which was then turned out to be a bestseller. The title is I'll Be Gone in the Dark. And we talked about that in True Crime Bookshelf last time. And now Billy has come out with his own book called Chase Darkness with Me, which is about his personal journey after growing terribly frustrated over a 17-year career, which continues to this day, of writing about true crime. He began to think, what could I do as an individual to begin to solve true crime? And this became kind of an obsession for Billy. He got very, very wrapped up in it, working incredibly long hours. He splits his time between Los Angeles and Arizona, but he often found himself, when he was away from his family at his apartment in Los Angeles, just putting in an incredible number of hours solving these cases and doing what a lot of people are referring to now as crowdsourcing. This is a couple of years ago, before these techniques were anywhere near as popular. He was experimenting with something where he would put out Facebook messages to specific groups of Facebook participants based on the parameters that Facebook can provide. So if you're an advertiser, you can purchase ads which show up, and I know some of us find them annoying occasionally, these pop-up ads that show up on Facebook. Well, because we all spend so much time on social media, they offer a significant amount of demographic data about you, not down to the individual level, but for example, if Billy knew that he wanted to reach people that lived in a particular location, that went to high school during a particular time frame, let's say we're talking about a cold case from a number of years ago, he could help define parameters and do very targeted outreach to individuals, asking people if they had any information about specific cold cases. And he racked up a significant amount of credit card debt doing this. At one point, he had $13,000 on his credit cards because he really sort of went down the rabbit hole. But it's a fascinating story about how he got completely wrapped up in these cases and experimenting with trying to solicit tips and information from people that might not have realized that they could have valuable information. He would then turn over the tips to law enforcement. And the whole story is about how he got just completely pulled into these techniques. It's a fascinating story and really quite interesting. The last chapter in the hardcover edition talks about the time frame from 2 years ago, shortly after Michelle McNamara had died, when he was out on a book tour with Paul Haynes and Patton Oswalt, and they were at a book appearance, one of these book readings in Chicago, and Michelle McNamara's family is from Chicago, so they were in attendance, and it was that night that they got the word that the Golden State Killer case might be breaking. They heard from Mike Morford, who was another friend of the show's and a friend of ours, and Morph, who had been following the Golden State Killer case with a great deal of zeal for a number of years. He's also an expert on the Zodiac and other unsolved cases. Morph sent them a message saying there's something going on. They're calling a press conference for tomorrow in Sacramento, California. And so they got the word that something was up, but no one knew exactly what it was. And then Billy started reaching out electronically. This is late at night after a long evening of book reading and socializing and a fair amount of cocktails. Long into the night, then, of course, the good news is he's writing to a lot of people on the West Coast where it was a bit earlier, texting people and reaching out and saying, what do you know about this press conference that's hitting in Sacramento tomorrow? And then he began connecting with the people that he knew from the sister survivors from the Golden State Killer case. These are the direct survivors and the mostly daughters of the crime victims. And they had received advance word that there was going to be a press conference and that not only was there a significant development in the case, but at this point, Joseph D'Angelo had been arrested. So that night, he tells the story about just being up late into the night, basically all night. And then he held off until 4:30 a.m. before he texted Patton Oswalt and said, I think they've got him. And Patton Oswalt, who had to get up, as Billy did, at 5 a.m. to catch a shuttle to the airport for the next stop on the tour. They were ultimately heading to CrimeCon. So this gives you an idea, Kristin, when this was. They just were beside themselves. And Billy talks about he allowed himself, I think he said 30 seconds of celebration where he was, sort of dancing around the hotel room, completely exhausted. And then he got back to his obsessive style researching. He now had a name, which he had never had before, Joseph D'Angelo. And so he started searching newspaper clippings, and he very quickly found a clipping that said that this police officer had been let go for shoplifting, two very chilling items, dog repellent and a hammer at a hardware store. And this guy had lost his job as a law enforcement officer and not contested the charges. And as Billy points out, most people in law enforcement, if they get in trouble, they're police union and they've got some people standing behind them, who are going to represent the individual officer who's been charged with inappropriate behavior or what have you. And Billy found it fascinating. This guy made no attempt whatsoever to contest the charges and allowed himself to be fired. And as Billy writes in the book, why would you steal a hammer and dog repellent unless you didn't want people to know those were the things that you were buying? Over the course of that same night, Billy continued to research and he discovered this guy was former Navy. And so all these boxes are being checked for Billy Jensen that night. They thought they were looking for someone who had a law enforcement background. It was from Northern California, who likely had a Navy background because of the elaborate knots that were used. Mm-hmm. And so many different things about this suspect who had never been on anyone's radar. So between the time they received the tip from Morph and others that there was news in the Golden State Killer case, and the next day when the actual event took place and they watched it via conference from New York, he had discovered so much about this guy, and it's very consistent with his just incredible commitment to getting at the truth. Mm-hmm. He ends the book in its first edition, which I have, with advice for citizen activists like himself who want to get involved in true crime and helping people solve America's 200,000 cold case murders across the United States, with a lot of practical advice about how to get involved and a lot of cautions about not outing people. He said, any number of people's lives have been destroyed by being outed as a potential perpetrator when in fact many of them are not. Accepting the fact that you're not going to get the credit, even if you do provide the information that leads to an arrest and a trial and a conviction. There are a lot of other people that will have worked on this case, and credit is not always fairly or equally distributed. And then, of course, he talks about the fact that many citizen sleuths like himself have put themselves at great risk and actually ended up being hurt or even murdered by criminals, because you are dealing with some pretty dark stuff. It's a fascinating read, Chase Darkness with Me by Billy Jensen.
Now, I actually had a different experience with it in that I listened to the audio version of it, which is read by Billy himself.
Oh, very cool.
And
I haven't done that. How is it?
It's wonderful because he's so expressive. He's so funny. And you really get a sense of immediacy when you are listening to him tell these, in some cases, very harrowing stories about crimes that have been committed in the research that he is trying to do. So I really enjoyed listening to the audio version. I don't normally do a ton of audiobooks, but since the pandemic, I have started listening to a lot more when I go on walks or runs or wherever it is that I am when I'm trying to get out of my own house. And so Chase Darkness with Me, the audio version, is also very, very good.
Oh, that doesn't surprise me. And then full disclosure, by the way, we've both met Billy at CrimeCon. He's a super nice guy, very, very thoughtful, very intense, extremely tall. I'm 6 feet tall. I don't normally feel short around people, but Billy's like 6'4" or 6'6". I mean, he just feels like a giant compared to the rest of us.
Yeah, oh my God, I know.
But doesn't surprise me that he would do a great job with the audiobook as well. And there's a great deal of intelligence and intensity to everything that Billy does. So I'm a big admirer. It's a great read. You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. One of the most frequent questions we're asked here at Mind Over Murder is, how can I help?
Thanks to Othram, a leading forensic DNA testing lab for law enforcement, you can get involved and help solve real cases.
If you have tested at a consumer genetics company, you can contribute your data to DNAsolves.com. The process is easy and confidential. Just 2 simple steps. Your DNA might be the missing piece that helps solve the identity of an unknown person.
Then Mind Over Murder will highlight cases Othram is working on to seek your crowdfunding support for DNA testing to help solve these cold cases.
Upload your DNA profile to DNAsolves.com. It's easy, free, and confidential.
Then join Mind Over Murder as we help families find answers with Othram and DNAsolves.com. In these stressful times, everyone needs some time to chill out and relax. That's why we're excited to announce this week's sponsor, Boston Green Health.
Boston Green Health is a local provider of CBD products that specializes in oils, topicals, gummies, and edibles. Boston Green Health's plant-based products can provide natural relief and rest for the mind, body, and soul.
As one of New England's premier hemp-based companies, they offer a variety of all-natural CBD products that use a blend of locally sourced hemp extract.
Visit bostongreenhealth.com for premium CBD oil, a delicious variety of CBD-infused gummies, luxurious handcrafted topicals, and a product line for pets.
Mind Over Murder listeners can receive 20% off any purchase by using show code MOM20.
Boston Green Health takes pride in being New England's most trusted CBD brand.
Visit bostongreenhealth.com and use show code MOM20 for 20% off any purchase. Do you like our show, Mind Over Murder, and want to create your own podcast?
Well then, let us tell you about Anchor.
First of all, it's free. And who doesn't love free, right?
I like free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer.
You can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before.
Anchor will then distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more platforms.
And you can even make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership.
I like the sound of that. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Right here, Anchor.
Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started on your own podcast.
You can tell them Kristin and Bill from Mind Over Murder sent you. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
So my next book is one that I am right in the middle of. Bill and I both chose books that we are currently in the middle of reading because we also wanted to kind of share that experience too. So the second book that I'm in the middle of reading that has another literary spin to it, because English teacher and true crime is just sort of my identity. This one is called Careless People, Murder, Mayhem, and the Invention of the Great Gatsby by Sarah Churchwell. I'm pretty sure that most people have read The Great Gatsby, either willingly or unwillingly in their career, whether it was in high school or college. You probably during that time also heard quite a bit about the life of F. Scott Fitzgerald and sort of the madcap mania that his life entailed. Scott, was a genius, but he was also very alcoholic and very self-destructive. The amount of insanity, if you will, that happened during the early part of the 1920s when he was just getting started in his career and he was enjoying a lot of success is what is discussed in this book, Careless People. So the book it's complex, and it's not really for the faint of heart, quite frankly, because you have to really love Gatsby and Fitzgerald in addition to loving true crime to really appreciate this. And I'm hoping that there's going to be at least a couple of people out there other than me who love literature, the novel, and true crime in the same way that I do. So for that vague handful of people, you are my people, and I hope that you enjoy this particular recommendation that I'm about to make. So Careless People, it's actually part literary history because you learn a lot about Gatsby and the writing of it and the world of it and where a lot of the symbols and influences came from. It's also part biography of Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald and the craziness of their lives in the early part of the 20s, back when Scott was enjoying an unprecedented level of literary success. And Zelda was just sort of riding along on his coattails. And it is also a part true crime romp, because right around the time that Scott Fitzgerald moved to Long Island, which is where Gatsby is set, in 1922, Long Island had actually been rocked by the news of a brutal double murder. This murder seems to be largely lost to time. There have been a couple of books written about it, but it's not one of the big cases that a lot of people tend to talk about, but it is fascinating and it is gruesome too. So the double murder of Eleanor Mills and Edward Hall was the talk of New Brunswick right around the time that Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda moved to the New York area. So Edward Hall was an Episcopalian minister, and he was found dead along with his parishioner Eleanor Mills. She sang in the choir, and they certainly had a relationship of some variety. Very likely they were having an affair. The papers never actually came out and said, legitimately that they were having an affair, but the way that they reported it was that they had a known acquaintance, or they had a long association. You can tell by the way they reported it that, these two were having an affair.
Reading between the lines a little bit there.
Yeah, for sure. The minister and his parishioner were both found shot to death in a field. They had been laid out underneath a crabapple tree. Both of their faces were covered, his with a hat, hers with a scarf. And they had been sort of displayed in this tableau that would make anyone who saw them understand that, yes, they did have a relationship. His hand was cradling her head, and her hand was resting on his thigh. And so they'd been, placed that way. So
they were displayed in this very unique way.
They were displayed, yeah. And in and amongst the bodies were shredded love letters, presumably love letters between the two of them.
I think someone was trying to make a point here, wouldn't you say?
I would certainly say so. Yeah, absolutely. So even though they were both married to other people, it was pretty clear that they were having an affair of some variety. It took a little bit. I mean, nowadays we would know to immediately look at the husband or the wife. We would immediately jump to that. I'm sure that's where everybody's mind went when I said it's these two people who'd been having an affair. It took the New Brunswick police a little bit longer to get there. So ultimately, the minister's wife was arrested for the crime along with her two brothers. They were brought to trial, but they were never able to be convicted because there was never enough evidence that could be found against them. So ultimately, technically, the Mills and Hall murders are unsolved, but that's just because nobody's ever actually been convicted for it.
And the year again is?
1922.
So forensics are not very advanced, to put it mildly.
Yeah. Well, and one of the interesting things that they had mentioned in the book was once it became clear via newspaper reporting where the crime scene actually was, and it was in the middle of a field on the property of a pig farmer. People started flocking to the crime scene, like even before the bodies had been moved, and they started taking souvenirs.
How did the word get out that the bodies were there before the cops even got there?
I'm not entirely clear on that part.
Well, you mentioned they were slow on the uptake.
I'm not entirely clear on how that, like, I would need to go back through and read it a second time,
Wow.
but people were actually showing up at the crime scene. Like, one of the pieces of evidence was a calling card, the minister's calling card that had been left resting on his shoe. Mm-hmm. People were picking it up and passing it around.
Wow.
So there was no available fingerprint, viable fingerprint evidence. It had even got to the point they said that people were stripping the bark off the crabapple tree where they were underneath so that they could have a little souvenir of the crime.
People are very strange then and now.
Yeah, for serious. So this was not just a small sort of local crime. It was front page news for like the entirety of 1922. I'm going to quote from the book here for 1 second. It would become one of the most famous murder mysteries of a murderous decade.
Big scandal.
Huge, absolutely huge. And it continued to, really sort of rocket across the headlines until probably the next biggest crime of that particular decade. And that was the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. And that was finally what sort of kicked this case off of the front pages. The book really discusses the impact that crime and that time period in that community had on F. Scott Fitzgerald and his creation of his classic masterpiece, The Great Gatsby.
And the careless people referred to in the title, are we referring to the two victims?
You could refer to the two victims. You could refer to Scott and Zelda. And there is a line out of The Great Gatsby where the narrator, Nick, refers to Tom and Daisy Buchanan as careless people.
Very interesting.
So it works on a lot of levels.
Yeah, kind of multidimensional.
It's the English teacher in me loves that part. So I'm reading it right now. I'm not all the way through it, but it is excellent. I can't put it down. It's really, really wonderful. So anyone who is fascinated by the 1920s as a decade, or in Scott Fitzgerald, or in true crime, or just in the novel, pick it up. You will love it. The title is Careless People, Murder, Mayhem, and the Invention of the Great Gatsby by Sarah Churchwell. And this one is from 2013.
Well, my next book is written by a friend of ours, Richard Foster, wrote an outstanding book. Richard is a journalist and editor who lives in Richmond, Virginia. He wrote an excellent book called Southern Nightmare, The Hunt for the Southside Strangler. This came out a couple of years ago. Richard's first book was a biography about the real Betty Page, the pinup star of the 50s. And so he sort of went from the sublime to the very dark with his second book, Southern Nightmare. Richard's book is a companion piece to a very good series of podcasts that he did a couple of years ago called Southern Nightmare, which covered the Southside Strangler case. The Southside Strangler case is distinctive for a number of reasons. One is that it involves a serial killer who killed at least 5 women and perhaps more in a series of crimes approximately 30 years ago in and around Richmond, Virginia, and then stretching further north from there. The case is mostly distinguished by the fact that it is one of the, and some people say the, first case that resulted in a conviction using DNA evidence. I know other people have made similar claims, but it's certainly one of the first cases to be solved using DNA evidence. Full disclosure, when we were first exploring doing Mind Over Murder, Kristin and I actually thought about doing a 3-person podcast with Kristin Dilley, Bill Thomas, and Richard Foster, but his schedule is such that he had just taken on a new job and he had too much going on, and we figured, well, 2 voices are probably enough. Richard's an outstanding journalist and also a very fine podcaster, and we got a lot of great ideas from him. The book is dark, but it does explore the time frame of Virginia 30 years ago and a lot of key players who overlap with the Colonial Parkway murders, including Dr. Marcello Fierro, a number of investigators from the Virginia State Police and other agencies who've worked on both cases. It's a fascinating case. Richard, like Kristin and me, has a strong feeling about focusing on the victims and not so much on the killer. So it's funny, he makes a very strong point of emphasizing the names of Carolyn Ham, Debbie Davis, Dr. Susan Helms, Diane Cho, and Sue Tucker, who were the 5 known victims of the Southside Strangler. Although he does talk about the perpetrator, he doesn't focus as much time and attention on the murderer, Spencer's his last name, as he does on the victims. And interestingly, Timothy Spencer, the protagonist, was the last person to be put to death in Virginia using the electric chair. Everybody since then who's been put to death by the Commonwealth of Virginia has opted for death by injection. It doesn't, obviously being put to death is a pretty horrible thing. I think the electric chair in particular, Old Sparky, its name was, last used in 1994 when Spencer was put to death. A fascinating story and really quite groundbreaking in terms of criminal justice here in the United States. And so the book is Southern Nightmare, The Hunt for the Southside Strangler by Richard Foster. And then we strongly recommend the podcast series as well.
Oh, yeah. That was one of those podcasts that I had to binge.
Yeah.
I was looking for excuses to do stuff around the house. I'll listen to podcasts while I'm cleaning a lot of times.
Yeah.
So I remember very distinctly going, what can I do around the house that's going to keep me cleaning for as long as possible so that I can listen to all of this,
right?
All at once. It is truly, truly excellent. So yeah, I totally am 100% on board with Bill's recommendation here. We do urge you very, very much listen to the podcast and get the book. All right. And then my last book is also pretty common in the true crime canon. I'm fairly sure that most people who are true crime enthusiasts will have read this, but in case you have not, my third book is In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, and I strongly recommend it. I had my advanced placement students read it as part of their summer reading assignment this past year, and they really enjoyed it, much more than I thought they would, quite frankly. It is, I think, one of the finest true crime books that I have read. Although, as I did tell my students this past year, there is some debate about how true a lot of Capote's narrative is. Bill's kind of making a funny face over there.
And at the same time, to give Capote credit, it's beautifully written.
Oh, yes.
Many people have argued that Capote has effectively invented the true crime genre. I mean, we obviously talked earlier about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Edgar Allan Poe and other great writers writing from a historical true crime point of view. But in terms of the modern true crime narrative, Truman Capote probably established the template.
Certainly. No, absolutely. For anybody who's not familiar with the criminal case behind In Cold Blood, it is based on the 1959 shotgun murders of the Clutter family in Holcomb, Texas. And that's Herb, Bonnie, Kenyon, and Nancy Clutter.
Yeah, it's a terrible story.
Oh, my God. And, Capote does not shy away from detail on this, but he does it in a way. He did try to be very respectful of the victims. There are some people who have argued that he doesn't do a great job on that because he does eventually shift over into a narrative where he focuses almost solely on the killers, Dick Hickok and Perry Smith. He does recreate the last days of their lives, and unfortunately he also very vividly recreates the last moments of their lives in a way that is both harrowing and beautiful. So Truman Capote called In Cold Blood a nonfiction novel. And if that sounds a little antithetical, it is. He wanted to make sure that he could take these real life events, but write about them in a way that would make people think they were reading a novel. And in that, he did succeed very, very well. I love In Cold Blood. I've read it 3-4 times at this point. And I really enjoyed working with my advanced placement students this past year, really digging into the narrative and also really taking a hard look at author's bias. What was Capote's purpose in writing this? Where does his bias show through? And what ultimately was his goal in writing this? Was it in honoring the victims, or was there a little bit more to it? He does have an anti-death penalty stance in there too, right at the end. So it's been interesting. It was interesting listening to a group of kids who, some of whom had not had much experience with true crime or with narratives of this type at all. They really dug it. They got into it. They thought it was interesting. And it was refreshing listening to them really take a solid look at something like this and go, this is cool. I think I'd like to read more like this. So I know I at least had a couple of kids who wanted to go on to read more of Capote after that. So yay.
And that sounds like a win from a writing teacher and an English teacher's perspective.
Anytime I can get kids interested in reading is a win for me, for sure. And they were very interested, as was I, when you kind of get into the backstory of it, about how long it took him to write the book. And he spent 6 years on it, because he couldn't publish it until he had an ending. And he always considered that he would not have an ending until the killers were executed. It took him 6 years to write the book. And he really, he started down the rabbit hole of drug use and drinking because he was under so much stress and tension as a result of this book. It is the second best-selling true crime book in history.
Now that makes me ask, what's number one?
Helter Skelter by Vincent Bugliosi.
I was thinking it was going to be John Douglas.
You would actually think it might be Mindhunter, but no. No, Bugliosi's Helter Skelter is number one, and In Cold Blood is number two. It is a great book to read if you have never had a chance to take a look at it. I highly recommend it, not just from like a true crime perspective, but also from a literary perspective. It is very, very well written. The one thing that I really enjoyed bringing up to my students that a lot of people don't know is that Truman Capote's childhood best friend, Harper Lee, helped him do a lot of the research for In Cold Blood.
This is Harper Lee of
To Kill a Mockingbird. He did not, however, give her credit. He didn't give her co-author credit. He only gave her a short note in the dedication.
Well, I guess it depends on what deal they had when they started that joint venture.
I think she went into it thinking that it would be a joint venture. There have been two really excellent movies that depict the writing of In Cold Blood, and that is Capote with Philip Seymour Hoffman. But yeah, there have been a couple of excellent movies, filmed about the development of the book itself. So I really can't recommend it enough. It's excellent.
And wasn't Harper Lee back in the news recently? Didn't they discover another book or something that Harper Lee had written?
Well, a couple of years ago, they did find a first draft of To Kill a Mockingbird, Go Set a Watchman. That's worth reading on its own, just like as a novel study of what To Kill a Mockingbird was. But they did find that she was working on a true crime book of her own that she was tentatively calling The Reverend. And that was a really interesting story. In fact, I think our next episode of True Crime Bookshelf, I'm going to have to talk about the book about Harper Lee's true crime novel, The Reverend.
That's what I recall hearing about, was that there was an incomplete manuscript, if I'm not mistaken.
And that case is fascinating. I mean, it's worth a whole episode all by itself. So the next time we do True Crime Bookshelf, I'll get into that. But yeah, the book about that was recently written is called Furious Hours by Casey Sepp. And I recommend that as well, but I'll talk about that more next episode of True Crime Bookshelf.
Sounds good. My last book is one I've just started, which is described as absolutely fascinating, and I'd have to agree. Some of you may remember that when we asked Colleen Fitzpatrick to talk with us, in the first of the two episodes that she did with us a couple of weeks ago now, she mentioned this hand being found up in Alaska and that she was involved in the forensic genealogical search for the hand's owner, that is, whose body was that. And in that example, a plane had crashed in 1948, Northwest Airlines Flight 4422, which was a DC-4, this is a prop plane, crashed with a crew of 6 on board and 24 merchant Marines. and they were on a 6-leg flight from Shanghai, China, to New York City, and they crashed after a refueling stop up in Alaska in a place called Mount Sanford. Colleen was involved in helping to identify these unidentified remains, this hand and arm that were found in a glacier years later by 2 pilots. And these 2 pilots, who were also mountaineers and adventurers, became fascinated by this story of Flight 4422, which had crashed with the merchant mariners on board. There were legends that there was gold aboard the plane. I'm not exactly sure how that part of the story got started, and I'm not all the way through the book, but this became like this legendary plane crash, and hundreds of people looked for this plane over the years. When the plane was ultimately found, what the Defense Department was mostly interested in was identifying the remains of these merchant mariners who had all died in the plane crash, and that's where Colleen was able to assist them. This is a fascinating story, and Kevin McGregor, one of the 2 pilots, wrote this account of their adventures. And then, of course, Colleen shows up fairly late in the story and was able to identify the remains, and then using advanced forensic genealogy was ultimately able to identify, I guess you'd say, owner of the arm. It's an absolutely fascinating story. I'm only partway through it. It's called Flight of Gold by Kevin A. McGregor, and it came out a couple of years ago, and it's just a fascinating read. I'm trying to find extra time to make my way through it. It would make an amazing movie, actually. As I read it, I thought, how come no one's made a movie of this thing? Because it's such a great story. You've got the tragedy, and then the adventure of these 2 pilots, and then you've got the whole forensic thing, and then discovering this man's long-lost relatives in Ireland. I just thought the whole thing was absolutely fascinating. So I definitely recommend it.
That is very cool.
We need to close out with one last book. Do you remember which one we said we wanted to mention? It was your special new book by Ron Peterson Jr.
Ron Peterson Jr., author of Under the Trestle, releases his new book, Chasing the Squirrel.
Which is a great title.
Chasing the Squirrel. The squirrel is in reference to Wally Thrasher, which is an excellent name, AKA drug smuggler.
AKA the Squirrel.
AKA the Squirrel, drug smuggler and kingpin here in Virginia, well, actually in Southwest Virginia. Ron did come and talk to us about Chasing the Squirrel. If you would like more information on Wally Thrasher and his exploits, you should definitely read the book. It sounds quite excellent. You can also go to Ron's Facebook page. He's got his personal page, and then he's got a page for Chasing the Squirrel. So I've already pre-ordered my copy, and I'm very much looking forward to reading it.
Well, and if we play our cards right, Ron did say he might come back and talk to us about Chasing the Squirrel and Wally Thrasher, who really sounds like an amazingly colorful character, to put it mildly.
Well, that's going to wrap it up for this episode of True Crime Bookshelf. So we hope you enjoy our recommendations. And even though things are still a little wacky in terms of bookstores being available, we do encourage you to shop local and shop independent if you possibly can, because those are the stores that are looking to survive in the midst of all of this wacky pandemic craziness that we've got going on here.
And we hope to do another edition of True Crime Bookshelf in the future. And if you've got book recommendations you want us to take a look at, we're always open to new suggestions. Kristin was saying before we started, both of us need to find some more time to read because our stack of unreads is getting too large. So we've got to find some extra time for that.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.